My name is Nora Prentice. I'm 43 years old, and on the Thursday before Thanksgiving, my own sister stood up at my parents' dinner table, raised her wine glass, and asked the whole room if anyone had ever actually met my husband's CIA handler, or if I'd made the whole thing up to feel important. The table laughed. My mother laughed. My father studied his plate like it owed him money. Marcus, my husband, sat beside me and didn't say a word. He just set his fork down very quietly, the way he does before something changes in a room. Across the table, a man I'd only met twice before, Walter Kingston, my sister's future father-in-law, wasn't laughing. He was watching me the way you watch a door you think you've seen open before. 2 days later, that same man would stand up in front of 40 people, look at me like I was someone he'd spent 9 years trying to find, and say a word out loud that no one at that table, except my husband, had ever heard me called. Skyfall. But to understand why a retired government man went still at my sister's joke, you have to go back further than Thanksgiving. You have to go back to who I was before I was ever Nora Prentice, the quiet sister, the disappointing one, the woman everyone assumed had married beneath her own boring life. Welcome back to Need to Know, the channel where the people everyone underestimated turn out to be the ones who were protecting them the whole time. If you've ever been the family member nobody bothered to ask a real question, stay with me, because this one earns the wait. Drop a comment and subscribe before we start, because you will want to see how this ends. I grew up in a house where my sister Renee was the sun and I was the furniture. That's not bitterness. That's just an accurate description of the seating chart. Renee was 2 years younger, louder, prettier in the way that photographs will. And from the time she was 6 years old, my parents built the whole household calendar around whatever she needed next. Dance recitals, debate trophies, a car for her 16th birthday that I never got for mine. I don't say this to complain. I say it because it explains everything that came after, including why nobody in my family ever asked me a single real question about my life for almost 20 years. I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who got a partial scholarship to a state school and studied international relations because I like maps and languages. And nobody at a single holiday dinner ever asked me what that actually meant. When I told my mother, Diane, that I'd been commissioned as an Army officer after graduation, she asked if that meant I'd be wearing a uniform to Renee's wedding someday. When I told her, years later, that I'd left the Army for a position with the State Department, my father, Harold, nodded and asked if it came with good benefits. Nobody asked what the position was. Nobody asked why I moved 4 times in 6 years to cities I couldn't fully explain, or why I sometimes disappeared for months and came back thinner, quieter, with a new scar I never talked about and didn't want to. Here's the truth I carried alone for almost 2 decades. The State Department cover was exactly that, a cover. I spent 12 years working for an agency I'm still not permitted to name in casual conversation, doing work I'm still not permitted to describe in detail. I was a case officer. I ran sources, built relationships in places most Americans couldn't find on a map, and did it under an operational designation instead of my own name. Because my own name was the one thing I couldn't afford to let travel with me into a room. That designation was Skyfall. Not a nickname I chose for myself, not something out of a movie. It was simply the word that came up on a rotation list the year I got my first solo assignment, the way a hospital assigns a patient number. Except this number followed me through 11 years of work that never once made the news. Because when that kind of work is done correctly, nobody ever hears about it at all. I met Marcus during my 4th year in the field. He worked logistics and support, the unglamorous scaffolding that keeps people like me alive and fed and moving. And he was better at his job than almost anyone I ever worked with. We fell in love the way two exhausted, careful people do, slowly, and mostly through the small kindness of him remembering how I took my coffee in 4 different countries. We married quietly, in a courthouse, with two witnesses who are still the only guests at our wedding besides each other. My family found out by phone call 3 weeks later, and my mother's first question was whether he had a steady job. I want to be honest about my own part in this, because a story like mine is easy to tell as pure victimhood, and that would be a lie. I let my family believe I was underachieving. I let them think I drifted from one vague government job to another because it was easier than explaining a truth I legally couldn't explain anyway. I let Renee introduce me at parties as her sister who does something with paperwork overseas. I told myself I was protecting them, and mostly I was. But some part of me, the part that grew up watching the sun always shine on someone else's side of the table, also let the silence sit there because correcting it would have meant asking for something I'd stopped believing my family had the capacity to give me, which was simply to be taken seriously. 5 years ago, I came home for good. Not by choice exactly, not at first. There's an assignment I still don't talk about in full. One that ended the way the hardest ones sometimes end, with people saved and a version of me that didn't come all the way back the same. I requested a transfer to a desk. Marcus requested one alongside me. We settled 2 hours from my parents, in a quiet house with a garden I actually get to tend now. And we told my family we both worked in logistics consulting for a shipping firm, which is true in the way a photograph of a lake is true. It shows you water. It doesn't show you the depth. I should tell you what that dinner 4 days later actually looked like, because it's the clearest snapshot I have of how invisible I was in my own family. My mother spent most of it describing a caterer she'd hired for Renee's upcoming engagement party, a party that hadn't even been announced yet, planned 6 months in advance, the way nothing in my life had ever been planned for. My father asked me once, in passing, whether the shipping industry was treating me well, and moved on to the next topic before I finished answering. Nobody noticed the small burn scar along my left forearm, still pink at the time, healing under a long sleeve I wore specifically so nobody would ask. I didn't want them to ask. I'd stopped expecting the asking to mean anything even when it happened. That's the part one thing people misunderstand about families like mine. It isn't that nobody ever glanced my way. It's that the glance never had any curiosity behind it. And after enough years, you stop mistaking attention for interest. That was the achievement nobody in my family ever knew to ask about. And it's the one I want you to hold on to, because it matters later. Before I left the field for good, I led the response team on what our internal files called the Kestrel Ridge Incident. 3 American aid workers taken during a landslide relief mission in a mountain region I still can't name out loud. I spent 3 days negotiating their release without a single shot fired, without a ransom paid, using nothing but patience, language, and the kind of calm my family had always mistaken for having nothing to say. All 3 workers came home. I received a commendation that exists in a file most people will never be cleared to read. And then I flew home and packed a suitcase and went to my mother's birthday dinner 4 days later, where nobody asked why I looked tired. I'm telling you all of this now, before the humiliation, before the dinner, because I need you to understand something about how betrayal works in a family like mine. It's never one big cruel moment. It's decades of small ones, stacked so evenly you stop noticing the weight until someone adds one more brick and the whole thing finally leans. The brick that started this particular collapse had nothing to do with me at first. It had to do with the inn. My grandfather built Prentice House with his own hands on a bluff overlooking the water, back when the town was smaller and the land was cheap. It became the family business, then the family identity. The kind of place where 3 generations of Prentices had learned to fold napkins and balance a ledger before they learned to drive. My parents ran it for 30 years. And 8 years ago, while I was between assignments and living 2 states away under a name that wasn't quite mine, my father made an investment decision that nearly lost the inn entirely. He never told me the details himself. I learned them the way I learned most things in my family, secondhand, and too late. A renovation loan against the property, a business partner who disappeared with half the capital, and a balloon payment due before Christmas that my parents did not have and were too proud to admit publicly. My mother called me, not to ask for help, because asking me for help had never occurred to her as a category of thing that existed, but to tell me, almost in passing, that they might have to sell the inn. I remember standing in an airport in a country I still can't name, holding a phone that was technically not supposed to be making that kind of call, and hearing my mother describe losing my grandfather's life's work in the same tone she used to describe a canceled hair appointment. I had a separation payment sitting in an account, money I'd earned the hard way, money that was supposed to become the down payment on a house someday when the two of us finally stopped moving. Instead, I wired $118,000 to cover the balloon payment and clear the renovation debt. And I did it the way I do everything, quietly and on paper. I called a lawyer, a woman named Rachel Simmons who'd handled some personal matters for me before, and I told her I wanted this documented properly. Not because I distrusted my parents exactly, but because I'd learned, in more rooms than I can count, that an undocumented favor disappears from memory the moment it's no longer convenient to remember. We drew up a promissory note. We recorded a lien against the property at the county registry, securing the debt against the inn itself, so that Prentice House could never be sold, gifted, or transferred to anyone without that debt being settled first. My parents signed it in Rachel's office on a Tuesday afternoon, thanked me with the kind of relief people show when a plane finally lands, and never brought it up again. Not once. Not at a single holiday in 8 years. I want you to hold on to that lien, the same way I held on to it quietly for 8 years, because it's going to matter enormously in a few minutes. Renee got engaged in the spring to a man named Preston Kingston, whose family owned a private consulting firm out of Washington and moved through rooms my family had only ever seen from a respectful distance. Preston's father, Walter Kingston, was a retired federal official, the kind of man whose old business cards probably still made junior staffers nervous, and my mother treated his approval like a verdict from God himself. Suddenly, the inn wasn't just a family business anymore. It became a symbol. My parents decided, without consulting me even once, that the perfect wedding gift for Renee and Preston would be Prentice House itself, free and clear. 100 years of family history handed over as a dowry to impress a man who didn't need impressing nearly as badly as my mother believed he did. Nobody told me this plan existed until Thanksgiving. That should tell you something about where I stood in that family's accounting. Thanksgiving fell on a gray, cold Thursday, and my mother had invited the Kingstons for the first time. The full introduction of both families before the wedding. The house was decorated the way it only ever got decorated for Renee. Garlands on the mantel. The good china out of the cabinet, my mother in a dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion. Marcus and I arrived a little early, the way we always do, and I noticed my mother's binder, the one she keeps for every important event, open on the counter with a tab labeled in transfer. I didn't say anything. I told myself I'd ask about it later, calmly, the way I ask about everything. I didn't yet know later would arrive faster and louder than I expected. Walter Kingston turned out to be a tall, careful man in his late 60s, the kind who shakes your hand and actually looks at your face while he does it. His wife had passed several years earlier. His older son, Grant, was mentioned once in passing and then not again, which I noticed the way you notice a missing photograph. A small silence with a shape to it. Preston was warm and a little nervous, clearly still learning how loud my family could get. Walter mostly listened. I remember thinking, early in that dinner, that he was the only person at the table actually paying attention to what was being said instead of waiting for his turn to talk. Renee had 2 glasses of wine before the turkey even came out, and by the time dessert arrived, she'd found her rhythm. She'd always had a gift for cruelty dressed up as charm, the kind of joke that lands and then, if you object, gets waved away as you being too sensitive. That night, her target was me, and specifically, my husband's job. It started small. She asked Marcus, in front of everyone, what exactly logistics consulting meant, in a tone that made clear she already assumed the answer was nothing. Marcus gave his usual careful, boring answer, and Renee smiled the way she does right before she says something designed to draw blood. Funny, she said, because Nora used to tell people you worked for the CIA. Remember that, Mom? She told half of Ridgeline Lane that her husband was a spy. I actually believed her for a week. I felt the table's attention swing toward me the way weather turns. I hadn't said that in years. Not since a nosy neighbor pressed too hard about Marcus's travel schedule back when we still lived in a town where people asked those questions. And I'd given the vaguest true-sounding lie I could think of just to end the conversation. I hadn't expected it to survive in family memory for a decade, waiting for a night like this one. My mother laughed, the bright, brittle laugh she saves for moments she wants to seem lighter than they are. Preston's father didn't laugh. He set his fork down. Renee wasn't finished. She turned to Walter and Preston, her voice climbing into the register she uses when she wants an audience larger than the room. Honestly, she said, it would almost be funny if it wasn't so sad. My sister spent her whole life needing people to think she's special. Government job, secret husband, all of it. Meanwhile, she's 43 and doesn't even own a house. She looked back at me, delivering the line she'd clearly been saving. What's her code name? Skyfall. She laughed at her own joke, delighted with herself, having no idea she'd just said the truest sentence of the entire evening, and no idea at all what it would cost her to have said it in front of the one man at that table who actually recognized the word. I didn't answer right away. I've spent years learning to let silence do work that words can't. So I picked up my water glass instead, and while I thought about what, if anything, was worth saying, I did something I do without noticing, tapping two fingers against the table. An old habit from years of sitting in rooms where you couldn't afford to show your hands were shaking even a little. I said only this. I said it a long time ago to a neighbor who wouldn't stop asking questions. I'm sorry it became a family legend. Then I looked at my mother and asked, as calmly as I could manage, what the tap in her binder marked in transfer meant. That should have been the moment the conversation turned toward me getting real answers. Instead, my mother's face did something I recognized instantly. The specific stillness of a woman caught mid-plant. She said we talk about it later, honey, not in front of company, and reached for the gravy like the subject had never come up at all. Walter Kingston hadn't touched his dessert. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't place yet, something between recognition and disbelief. The look of a man doing arithmetic he wasn't prepared for at a stranger's dinner table. I didn't understand it that night. I understood it 2 days later. If you've ever sat at a table and felt the whole room quietly deciding you were the joke, you already know exactly how that dinner felt from the inside. Stay with me, because Renee's joke was about to become the single worst mistake of her engagement. Type I'm here if you've been underestimated by your own family. And keep watching, because the next part is where the paper starts talking. I didn't sleep much that night. Marcus found me at the kitchen table at 1 in the morning with my laptop open, not doing anything useful, just needing to be near the only person in the world who actually knew who I was. He sat down across from me and asked the obvious question. Do you want to say something to your family? Finally. All of it. I thought about it honestly, because he deserved an honest answer. I told him I'd spent 12 years being careful for a living, and I wasn't about to become reckless with the truth now, just because my sister had embarrassed me at a dinner table. If the truth ever came out, I said, it would come out on paper, in a room I controlled, not as a shouted correction over cranberry sauce. He nodded. He's good at understanding exactly what I mean even when I say it badly. The in transfer, though, that I could investigate immediately, and I intended to. The next morning, I called my mother and asked, plainly, what the binder tab meant. She hedged for a minute, the way she does, and then told me, almost proudly, that she and my father had decided to give Prentice House to Renee and Preston as a wedding gift. Free and clear, she said, using the exact phrase, like she'd rehearsed it. A fresh start for them, and a way to keep the inn in the family the right way, with people who'll actually be there for the long haul. I asked her, still calm, whether she remembered a lien on that property. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause I recognized from every deposition and debrief I'd ever sat through. The specific silence of someone deciding how much of the truth they can get away with. She said something vague about an old family loan being ancient history, water under the bridge. Surely I didn't want to make things difficult right before Renee's wedding. I told her I needed to see whatever documents she and my father had drawn up, and I told her I'd call her back. Then I called Rachel Simmons. Rachel still had the full file. The promissory note, the recorded lien, all of it exactly where we'd left it 8 years earlier, still valid, still enforceable, still sitting quietly in the county registry the entire time my parents had apparently decided to forget it existed. She pulled the county records while I sat on the phone, and she confirmed what I already knew. The lien was properly filed, properly notarized, and legally binding. Prentice House could not be transferred to anyone, gifted or sold, without either paying off the debt or getting a signed release from me. Rachel asked me directly whether my parents had approached me about signing one. I told her not yet, but that I suspected the request was coming, wrapped in exactly the kind of guilt my family specializes in. Rachel suggested I go a step further than just trusting her file, and I agreed, because I've never once run an operation on secondhand paperwork when I could confirm it myself. The county registry sat above the courthouse downtown, a small office with metal filing cabinets and a clerk named Arthur Lang, who'd apparently processed half the property records in that county for 30 years. He remembered the Prentice lien the moment I gave him the parcel number, and he didn't need to search long before he slid the recorded document across the counter to me himself. It's all still active, he said, filed correctly, properly indexed. Nothing has ever come in to release it or challenge it. He looked at me over his glasses and added that he'd actually fielded a call 2 days earlier from a woman claiming to be settling an old family matter, asking how a release would need to be filed if all parties agreed. He hadn't given her anything more than the standard form, because that's all his job allowed him to give anyone. I didn't have to ask who the caller was. I already knew my mother's voice well enough to imagine it perfectly, bright and hurried, hoping a stranger behind a counter would make her problem disappear faster than her daughter would. I was right. My mother called again that same afternoon, her voice gentler now, the tone she uses when the anger hasn't worked and she's reaching for the older tool underneath it. She told me she'd spoken to a lawyer, a friend of Preston's family, actually, who'd drawn up a simple release form, just a formality, she said, so we can get the property transfer done cleanly before the wedding. She asked if I could come by and sign it, quietly. No need to make a whole thing out of it in front of everyone. I asked her, gently, whether she remembered where that $118,000 had actually come from 8 years ago. She said of course she remembered. It was such a generous loan, and I noted the word loan, spoken like it was already something fully repaid instead of a debt that had never once been mentioned again until it stood in the way of a plan. I told her I'd think about it. I did not sign anything. While I was untangling the inn, something else was moving that I didn't yet know about. And this is the part of the story where I have to hand the narration briefly to Walter Kingston, because I only learned what he did over the following 2 days from Marcus, from Preston, and eventually from Walter himself, sitting across from me with more humility than I ever expected from a man his age and his history. Walter had spent the better part of 30 years in a career he described to me later only in the vaguest terms. The same vague terms I used myself which told me everything I needed to know about what kind of career it actually was. 9 years earlier, his older son Grant, 26 at the time and working an aid rotation in a mountain region overseas, had been taken during a landslide relief mission along with two colleagues. Walter had spent 3 of the longest days of his life in a windowless briefing room being told almost nothing. The way families of people in dangerous work are told almost nothing. Until the afternoon, he got the call that all three had been released, unharmed, negotiated out without a ransom paid and without a shot fired. Nobody ever told him the name of the officer who ran that negotiation. He wasn't cleared for that, and frankly, neither was Grant. But years later, as a father entitled to a partial debrief once the case was fully closed, Walter had been allowed to read a single redacted summary. A few paragraphs with almost every identifying detail blacked out, except for two things that stuck with him for 9 years. The initials of the lead officer, NP, and a detail Grant had told him himself, years after the fact. Over a bottle of wine one Christmas Eve, Grant said the officer who talked their captors down for 3 straight days had a habit of tapping two fingers on the table whenever she was thinking, and had said one sentence to the three of them, quietly, the moment she finally walked them out. "We're not leaving without everyone." Walter told me later that he'd carried those two details for 9 years the way some people carry a photograph, not expecting to ever match them to a face, just needing to know the person existed and had a shape, even an incomplete one. He'd done his own quiet homework on Renee's family before the engagement went further, the way careful men do, and it had come back unremarkable. A quiet inn on the coast. A quiet older daughter who apparently drifted through government logistics jobs. Nothing that raised a flag, because nothing about my cover was ever built to raise a flag. Then he sat across a Thanksgiving table from that quiet older daughter, watched her tap two fingers against the wood while she considered her sister's cruelty, and heard her say, in a voice that didn't rise even slightly, that she was sorry a private lie had become a family legend. He told me afterward that he didn't sleep that night either. He said he told himself it was almost certainly nothing, a coincidence built out of a grieving father's hope, and that a responsible man doesn't chase a wound like that without being sure. So the next morning, using contacts he still had from 30 years in rooms like the ones I used to work in, he made two careful, entirely legal phone calls, the kind available to any next of kin with the right clearance history, requesting to know if there was any possibility of confirming an identity behind a partial redaction from a 9-year-old case file. He wasn't asking anyone to break a law. He was asking, quietly, whether a very specific set of initials, a very specific old operational designation, and a woman currently living 2 hours from his son's fiancé's family might be connected. It took less than a day for someone who owed him a favor to tell him, off the record and unofficially, that he wasn't wrong to wonder. He didn't call me. He didn't confront my family. He did what I would have done in his position, which is exactly why I came to respect him as much as I eventually did. He waited for a room he could control, and he asked Preston to move up a dinner that had already been planned. An engagement dinner at the Kingston house 2 nights after Thanksgiving, meant originally as a smaller, calmer gathering to formally welcome our family. He simply decided it would happen a little sooner than planned, and that he'd be doing some talking of his own. I didn't know any of this yet. What I knew, on the Friday after Thanksgiving, was that my mother had left 3 messages asking about the release form, that Renee had texted me a single line that read, "Don't be dramatic about this. It's just a house," and that Rachel Simmons had finished preparing a full accounting of the debt, principal and 8 years of accrued interest as specified in the original note, coming to just over $190,000. I printed 3 copies. I put them in a plain folder, the same kind I'd used for the original documents. And I told Marcus I intended to bring it to the Kingston dinner, not to embarrass anyone, but because I was done letting my family's convenience decide when the truth got to exist. If you've ever watched your own family try to erase something you sacrificed for them, you already know the particular kind of calm that settles over you once you decide you're not going to argue anymore. Just document. Stay close, because the dinner where two very different truths were about to collide is coming up next, and it changes everything for everyone in that room. Comment below if you think Renee has any idea what's coming, and subscribe so you don't miss it. The Kingston house sat on a quiet street outside the city, handsome and understated in the way that real money often is. Nothing gaudy about it, just good bones and good taste. My parents arrived first, Renee and Preston not far behind, all of them dressed for an evening they believed was simply the second act of a happy introduction. Marcus and I arrived last, and I carried the plain folder in a tote bag by my side. Unremarkable, the way the most important paperwork in my life has always looked. Dinner started warmly enough. Walter was gracious, funny even, asking my father questions about the inn's history with what I now understood was genuine, careful interest rather than idle politeness. I noticed him watching me more than the conversation strictly required, and once or twice I caught him glancing at my hands, and I understood, though I could have explained why yet, that something in him was checking, confirming, deciding. It was Renee who forced the moment forward, because cruelty, once rewarded, rarely knows how to stop on its own. Riding the high of Thanksgiving's laughter, she brought the joke back out for a second audience, this time aimed more sharply, since she now had a full dinner of Kingston family friends to perform for. She turned to me partway through the main course and said, with a little theatrical flourish, "Tell everyone the spy story, Nora. Go on. Tell them about your secret CIA husband." She looked around the table, delighted with herself. It's honestly the funniest thing about our family. The table gave her the polite, uncertain laugh that people give when they're not sure if they're allowed to find something funny. And that's when Walter Kingston set down his glass, stood up slightly at the head of his own table, and asked the room for quiet in a voice that had clearly commanded far larger rooms than this one. He didn't look at Renee when he spoke. He looked at me. He said he wanted to tell a story of his own, if I didn't mind, and he asked it as a genuine question, waiting for my small nod before he continued, which told me he already understood exactly what he was about to do to the evening. He told the table about his son Grant, about a landslide relief mission 9 years ago, about 3 days that had felt, to a father sitting at home, like the entire length of his life. He told them that the government had never given him a name, only a redacted file and two small details his son remembered clearly enough to repeat at every Christmas since: a habit of tapping two fingers on a table, in a single sentence spoken the moment the door finally opened. "We're not leaving without everyone." The table had gone completely silent. My mother's fork was frozen halfway to her mouth. Renee's smile had started to falter without her quite understanding why yet. Walter turned to me fully then, and asked, in a voice gentler than I expected, whether I had ever gone by the designation Skyfall. I felt Marcus's hand find mine under the table, not to stop me, just to be there. I thought about 12 years of careful silence, about a lifetime of my family assuming the quiet daughter had nothing worth asking about a sister who had just used the truest word in her whole vocabulary as a punchline. And I decided, in that room, with that man, for that reason, that the silence had finally found its ending point. I told him, plainly, that I couldn't discuss the details of any assignment, and that he understood exactly what that sentence meant, because a man with his history knows precisely which door that answer opens. But I told him, yes, for 11 years, that was my name in rooms most people never get to know exist. And 9 years ago, in a country I still can't say out loud at a dinner table, I brought 3 people home who weren't supposed to come home, and I have never once, in 9 years, needed anyone to thank me for it, because doing the job quietly was always the entire point. Walter Kingston, a man who had spent 30 years in rooms full of powerful people without, by his own later admission, ever once losing his composure, stood there with tears in his eyes at his own dinner table and said only this: "That's my son, Grant, you're describing. You brought my son home to me." I want you to picture that table for a second, because I've replayed it more times than I can count. My mother, who had spent 40 years treating my career like an embarrassing hobby, sat frozen, the color gone from her face. My father stared at his plate exactly the way he had 2 nights earlier, except now the silence meant something entirely different. And Renee, who had built the last decade of family gatherings on the reliable joke that her sister was a fantasist who invented an important life to feel special, sat there watching the single most important man at that table cross the room to embrace me like I was something precious he'd been looking for since before his own son had children. Preston looked at Renee, and I watched something shift on his face. The particular expression of a man realizing his fiancée had spent an entire holiday humiliating a woman who had, quite literally, saved his father's family. Renee opened her mouth to say something, and for the first time in her adult life, nothing came out. I let the moment breathe. I've learned, over many years and many rooms, that the truth rarely needs help landing once it's actually spoken aloud. But I had one more piece of paper in my bag, and I decided the same evening that had already cracked one family secret open was as good a night as any for the second. I set the plain folder on the table, next to the dessert plates, and I looked at my parents. I said that since we were finally being honest at this table, there was something else that deserved the same treatment. I told the room, calmly, about a foreclosure notice 8 years earlier, about a balloon payment my parents couldn't make, about $118,000 I wired from a country I still can't name to save a 100-year-old family in, and about a promissory note and a recorded lien that made sure the debt could never quietly be forgotten, the way so many things in my family had always quietly been forgotten. I told them that same lien was still sitting in the county registry, valid and enforceable, and that it meant Prentice House could not legally be gifted, free and clear, to anyone, including Renee and Preston, without either paying the debt in full or getting a signed release from me. I slid a copy of the promissory note and the lien across the table to my father. His signature, my mother's signature, both plainly visible at the bottom, exactly where they'd put them 8 years earlier and apparently hoped to never see again. My mother found her voice first, and predictably, it reached for guilt. She said, in a shaking whisper, that she couldn't believe I'd bring up money on a night like this, after everything they'd done for me. I told her, as gently as I could manage in a room still absorbing an entirely different revelation, that I wasn't bringing up money. I was simply refusing to let a debt get erased the same way my whole career had been erased for 20 years. Quietly, because acknowledging it was inconvenient. Walter Kingston, still standing, looked at my parents with an expression that had cooled considerably from the warmth he'd shown me only minutes earlier. He said, evenly, that he'd spent his whole professional life around people who tried to rewrite inconvenient facts, and that he had no interest in his son marrying into a family that was still practicing that particular habit. He didn't forbid the wedding. That was never his to forbid. But he made it clear, in front of everyone, that any wedding gift built on erasing what I'd actually done for that family would not have his blessing, and that if Renee and Preston wanted his support building their future, it would start with an honest accounting of exactly what this family owed to exactly the person it had spent years pretending didn't matter. Justice, I've learned, rarely needs to be loud once the facts are finally allowed into the room. Nobody had to raise their voice. Nobody had to storm out. The truth simply sat there on the table between the dessert plates, in my mother's own handwriting, next to my husband's real job finally spoken out loud by the one man in the room with the standing to confirm it. And it did the work on its own. The weeks after that dinner unfolded the way real consequences usually do, slowly, and mostly through paperwork rather than drama. My parents came to Rachel Simmons' office 3 weeks later, without me having to ask twice. and we worked out a fair settlement. The inn was appraised properly for the first time in a decade. My parents agreed to a structured repayment of the debt, principal and interest, over 5 years, and Renee and Preston agreed, calmly and without theater, that the inn's future ownership would be decided honestly, with everyone's name and everyone's contribution on the paper, instead of handed over as a prize in a story that had never been true to begin with. Renee didn't apologize immediately, and I didn't expect her to. Apology has never come easily in my family. Accountability even less so. But 3 months later, she called me, not to ask for anything, just to talk, which was new enough on its own that I noticed it immediately. She asked, quietly, whether it was true, all of it, the 11 years, the country she still doesn't know the name of, the 3 people I brought home. I told her what I could, which wasn't much, and she was quiet for a long moment before she said something I hadn't expected. She said she was sorry, not for the joke exactly, but for 20 years of never once wondering what her sister's actual life might have looked like underneath the surface she'd been so comfortable mocking. It wasn't a full reckoning. It was a start, and I've learned to let starts be enough. My mother has apologized twice now, in her own careful, incomplete way, and I've decided that's likely all I'll ever get, and I've made a kind of peace with that. My father, in typical fashion, said very little, but he drove out to see Marcus and me a few weeks after the settlement, sat at our kitchen table, and asked, haltingly, what my work had actually been like. It was the first real question about my life he'd asked me in over 2 decades. I answered as much as I legally could, and he listened the entire time without once interrupting, which from him was its own kind of apology. Walter Kingston and I still talk from time to time. He introduced me, eventually, to Grant, now in his mid-30s, married, working in agricultural policy of all things, entirely unaware for 9 years that the quiet officer who walked him out of the worst 3 days of his life would one day sit across a Thanksgiving table from his own father, being mocked by her sister for a job she was never allowed to defend herself over. Grant hugged me for a long time the first time we met, and neither of us said very much, because some gratitude doesn't need a lot of words to land. There was one more piece of paper in this story, and I want to give it its due before I close out the year that changed everything. 6 weeks after the settlement, an envelope arrived at our house with no return address, just my name and handwriting I didn't recognize at first. Inside was a single sheet, a copy of the same redacted debrief summary Walter had carried for 9 years. Except this time a note was clipped to the front in his handwriting. He'd gone back through proper channels, the legitimate ones available to him as a father who'd waited nearly a decade for an answer, and requested that a few more lines be declassified now that the case was long closed and the parties involved had been independently confirmed to each other. It wasn't much, 3 additional sentences describing the extraction itself, still careful, still cautious about names and places, but enough that for the first time in 11 years, I held a piece of paper that acknowledged, in the government's own quiet language, that the work had happened and that it had mattered. I didn't cry over much in those years. I cried over that. Renee and Preston married the following spring, in a ceremony that was smaller and, I think, more honest than the one originally planned. I stood up during the toast, and for the first time in my life at a family event, I didn't feel like furniture. I told the room, briefly, that families are built less on the stories we tell about each other, and more on whether we're willing to actually look at each other clearly, even when it's inconvenient, even when the truth doesn't match the story we'd rather keep telling. My mother cried. Renee squeezed my hand under the table. It wasn't a perfect ending. Our family still has old habits it slips back into sometimes, the way any family does. But it's an honest one now, which is more than we had for most of my life. Marcus and I still live in our quiet house with the garden. He still calls it logistics consulting when strangers ask, and I still let him. Because some habits of privacy are worth keeping even after the biggest secret has already found daylight. Prentice House still sits on its bluff over the water, its future finally written down in the open, with every name on the paper that belongs there. And every year now, at Thanksgiving, there are no more jokes about my husband's job because everyone at that table finally understands there was never anything funny about it in the first place. There was only a woman who spent 20 years being underestimated by the people who should have known her best, and a debt of respect that, unlike the money, took a lot longer than 8 years to finally get paid back in full. If your own family has ever decided your quiet was the same thing as your unimportance, I want you to hear this clearly. Being underestimated is not the same as being small. Sometimes the person everyone laughs about at the dinner table is the only reason there's still a dinner table to sit at. Tell me in the comments if you've ever been the quiet one who turned out to be caring more than anyone knew. Share this with someone who's spent their whole life being underestimated by the people who should have looked closer. And subscribe to Need to Know, where the people everyone overlooked always turn out to be the ones who were holding everything together the whole time.